Carolyn Bennett will be heading up Canada's crown-Indigenous relations and northern affairs, and Jane Philpott is the new Minister of Indigenous Services. Joining us now to share their views is Niigaan Sinclair, Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba, and Pam Palmater, Chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. Welcome to you both.
Bonjour.
Thank you.
Pam, if we could start with you, are two ministries better than one?
Well, I guess the question is, was INAC good before such that we need two of them? And to my mind, I would think that's not the case. Just in terms of the bureaucratic nightmare of First Nations trying to deal with, the bureaucrats on the inside, but also having worked at Indian Affairs, I can only imagine the nightmare those employees are going through in terms of trying to divide their files.
Niigaan, the Prime Minister says this is a move away from the Indian Act. Is that something you would agree with?
Well, I mean, I echo Pam's concerns regarding more bureaucracy. I think to solve a problem, more bureaucracy has never solved it, and that's a real deep concern. But, I mean, there is a bit of a win here in that the federal government is recognizing that there's a real problem with one body dealing with the relationship, which is inevitably broken on every level, and then the issue of services. And when it came to the issue of the relationship, that was always what was left out of the equation. There's never any conversation about actually breaking the relationship. So if this is heading in an area of removing the Indian Act or replacing it or looking at trying some sort of RCAP recommendation of dealing with people in a different way, that's a positive sign. However, I have a real concern. However, this government has this tendency to announce things without thinking about them whatsoever, or consulting, or having a plan. There's no even terms of reference for what these two departments are going to do and who takes care of what when it comes to overlapping issues.
Pam, you mentioned the bureaucracy. Do you think people on the ground in the communities anywhere are even going to know where to start to find services here with these two new ministries being announced?
Of course not. None of that information has been worked out. I mean, under the Indian Act, it's one minister that has delegation for all of the powers under the Indian Act, and there's not a delegation for two ministers. So most people are going to be confused about who's going to be responsible for additions to reserves. That's right, consultation, or is that Indigenous Services? I mean, it's very basic. But when you look at what's happening here, what has been the problem with INAC? Was it organization charts, office locations, or the structure of the department? Or was it the people who headed and worked at Indian Affairs that made really horrible decisions on our behalf? And so you could have 5 Indian Affairs if you want to. If they continue down the same road of controlling our lives, making these bad decisions, very little change, but you'll have more costs for more ministries.
Niigaan, you mentioned the nation-to-nation relationship and consultation, yet this decision, this cabinet shuffle seemed to come out of nowhere, catch a lot of people by surprise. Do you think there was much consultation leading up to this announcement and this change?
No, this reminds me of the situation when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action were announced, and then 30 seconds later the Prime Minister said, we agree and we buy into all of these 94 calls, and subsequently they've withdrawn from most of them. So it's tiring to watch a government make a commitment and then having to catch up to their own claims later. It's actually disheartening, and it creates a lot of apathy, I think, amongst young people. So I have concern about that. However, I would like to be optimistic that there is intention here. I just think the delivery is poor.
This is a government halfway through its mandate right now, and now you're creating 2 new ministries that would take a lot of work. Are they going to be able
money? I mean, really, the situation is that how do you divide up the issue? We're already chronically underserviced as it stands. I mean, we still have massive funding issues on First Nations in terms of services. So now you're going to take money out of services and deal with the Crown First Nations relationship, which inevitably is going to go into governance. It's going to go into how decisions are made, and ultimately it's going to go into if self-government is the move, which I'm very suspicious about, because it's inevitably municipality creation. It's very concerning to think about how much work that's going to take to try to get the government, A, to understand what First Nations actually want, and B, to actually deliver it.
Pam, Indigenous Affairs, by whatever name was created to assimilate Indians, is this rather another step towards the extinguishment of those rights?
Well, I have to ask, what's different in the plan? So with Trudeau Sr., the plan was get rid of the Indian Act, get rid of INAC, and get rid of Indians and reserves. So that got reformulated under Harper, and the plan was, hey, let's get rid of the Indian Act, let's privatize reserves and stop funding all of these things. So now you have a new plan, which is get rid of the Indian Act, which implies get rid of reserves and everything that goes along with that. So I'm wondering, what has changed in the plan, except that the Prime Minister is not doing what he said he would. He promised he was elected, no more unilateral decisions to be made by this government, everything to be done in consultation, partnership, and he hasn't done that. And then really not too many people have talked about the choices that he's made for these ministers. You have Bennett has not fulfilled any of the Prime Minister's campaign promises, not fully lifted the cap, not funded First Nations education, and has fought First Nation quality of First Nation care against stock. Then you have a former Minister of Health who would provide money for sides, chronically underfunded health program, and equally fought against any equality for First Nations. So these are the two that are going to be leading reconciliation. I think that in itself is really problematic.
Niigaan, what else is at stake here when Canada accepts its Crown relationship with Indigenous peoples?
Oh, well, the biggest issue, absolutely, is that First Nations want to deal with the Crown in a different form, for the most part, than the AFN. They want to deal with it on a basis of an actual nation-to-nation relationship. And I think First Nations generally are open to the idea suggested under RCAP that to organize themselves how they wish to organize themselves. And that so the issue of representation and who speaks for who where is an issue that First Nations need to deal with. And if the government is open to that, I think that could move along the process. I think if the government had rolled out this idea as a consultation, maybe in a roundtable format, they might have gotten a more warmer reception. However, just to dump it when there are much more pressing issues at hand, most of us are dealing with the issue of children in care or the over-incarceration of young people, the suicides, and of course the issue with the Murder Missing Indigenous Women inquiry. Most of us are dealing with those on a daily basis. This came out of almost nowhere.